what are the visas that are applicable and not applicable for a staff nurse? Because often, people will come to me or, to our team and say, can I get an H1? Am I qualified? What about an EB2? And what is an EB3? If you can maybe run through just the visas that are applicable for a staff nurse, I think that would be very helpful.
Okay, so yeah, since my introduction has to do with my old age,
Not your old age, Carl, your experience.
I mean, back in the 70s and 80s, I actually worked for the government, and I went into private practice. And I maybe because my wife's Filipino, I don't know, but nurses seem to be something that I've done for over 40 years now. And there was an easy visa. All nurses could get something called an H1 visa. And then in 1990, the laws were changed. They took nurses out of the category. They actually put fashion models into the category. It didn't make any sense at all. Later on, I testified in front of the Senate Immigration Committee, and I said, you have to bring back a temporary visa that will apply to all nurses. And so far, they have not done that. But they created a visa back in 1990 called an H-1B visa. And it said that you had to have a job which required a 4-year college degree or equivalent. The problem is that a lot of hospitals here, a lot of nurses that are educated in the U.S. get only 2-year degrees, and then they're hired on by healthcare facilities. So when those healthcare facilities say, oh, this nurse from the Philippines or wherever has to have a 4-year degree, they usually get denied because they say, well, look, the other nurses that you hire from America don't have 4-year degrees. So H-1Bs can be an alternative for some nurses, particularly nurses that are very educated. So if you have a nurse practitioner, that's an easy H-1B. If you have a CRNA, which is a certified registered nurse anesthetist, that's an easy H-1B. We've been successful with some of the other ones like nurse managers, but a couple things about the H-1B. One, it's a lottery every year. There's only 85,000 that can get approved and over 200,000 applications. There are some employers who are exempt from the lottery, particularly universities, but it is harder to get a nurse an H-1B than an IT worker or an engineer or an architect. So what do we do for most nurses? The only practical temporary visa right now is the TN, the Trade NAFTA visa. And the TN only works if you are a citizen of Canada or Mexico. But a lot of the nurses over the last 10 years, given the difficulties of immigrating to the US, have immigrated mostly to Canada. And boy, almost every hospital I represent, they're probably up there in Canada right now. I'm in Los Angeles, but they're in Canada. We're bringing the nurses here. But I would say in a year or two, they're going to go through all those TN nurses. So really the hospitals have to get together and lobby Congress so there's a temporary visa for nurses. Right now, we usually go straight to permanent residence, and it takes a while. So we need a temporary visa category.
Thank you, Carl. I see that Leo was asking. So I mean that that really explains. I think just to sum up, for most of the staff nurses, and a lot of nurses in Lafora are regular staff nurses. It sounds like unless you are a citizen of Canada, it's pretty much the EB3 green card that you would be going through, right?
That's exactly right.
And Carl, I wanted to add something on the TN. We had questions from people that wanted us to discuss the TN. Have you seen any complications in getting TNs in the past 6 months for Canadian nurses that are specifically Filipino educated? And the question is the same for you, Chris. Have you seen any?
Are we still on together? I don't hear anyone.
Yeah, we are.
I can hear. Maybe I can address it. So, yeah, the TN is fine. We see no problems. One very important thing is that you must have the state license if you're going to use your TN. So, for instance, if you're going to take a job in Texas, you have to have that Texas state license when you proceed to the border, the American-Canadian border or the airport. And then the second thing is you need the visa screen, which I know we're going to address in a little bit. But if you have both of those and you have an offer from an American hospital, we don't really see many problems. Of course, from time to time, the officer is maybe unfamiliar with the process, but as lawyers, we all pick up the phone and we talk to the officers and normally can get that straightened out fairly quickly.
Yeah, I think that's a good question to raise, Jacob. I'm glad that you raised that because, we bring thousands of Canadian nurses to the US. And typically, as Chris says, we really haven't seen many issues with that. As long as the nurse has got all the licensure that is required, and also that the letter for the TN is formatted into the correct TN, into the correct format, because that's sometimes where you have some issues. But we actually have a checklist for nurses going through, and I know, as lawyers, you have that as well. And I think it's, it seems to be still pretty straightforward, as long as the nurses have the license.
And Tanya, one question we often see at our law office is if I'm Filipino or I'm Indian and I am in Canada, am I able to use the TN? And the answer comes down to whether or not you hold a Canadian passport, which is to say whether or not you're a Canadian citizen. So if you're in Canada and you are a Canadian citizen and you hold a Canadian passport, then yes, you can utilize the TN. But if you're in Canada, even if you're a licensed nurse in Canada, even if you have the US visa screen, even if you have the US state license, even if you have the letter that Tanya talks about, but you're only a landed immigrant or a Canadian green card holder, then unfortunately you cannot use the TN. So again, the question really comes down to whether or not you're a Canadian citizen or not. And we're not really talking about Mexican citizens, although because there's only a very tiny amount of Mexican nationals who typically meet the nursing standard. But theoretically, the same would be true for Mexican nationals, since Mexico is also a signatory to the NAFTA deal.
Yeah.
And Chris raises a really good point. We get asked a lot by nurses, particularly nurses from the Philippines. There are some Filipino RNs that go to Canada and they don't become RNs in Canada. They're like LPNs and so on. But if they get the nurse license of Texas or California or wherever the state is, and they were a nurse in the Philippines, they can get a TN even though they're not an RN in Canada.
Yes.
Correct. But they still have to be Canadian citizens. And that's Chris mentioned a great point, because people confuse that. They think just because they have a legal right to live in Canada, they're not qualified for a TN yet.
Correct.
Canadian citizens.
And I think it really boils down to, and I think a lot of people get confused, is that the Canadian TN is based on your citizenship, whereas the green card is based on your country of birth. So I think that's kind of the differentiator, and that can come where some of the confusion can come into it. Before we move off this topic of the different visas, though, I just wanted to raise the one question that Leo Ralph asked. What can you say about the EB2?
Okay, so the advanced practice nurses that I was talking about, the same nurses that would be able to get a TN, if they require an advanced degree, like a master's degree, a PhD, or even a bachelor's degree plus 5 years experience, then they're able to go to the EB2 category, which is for higher degree professionals, instead of EB3, which is people with bachelor's degrees or people even without university degrees, skilled and unskilled workers. And that can be an important thing. And the reason that it is important is there's 3 countries of birth. Again, we're going from, country of citizenship to country of birth. And those 3 countries are China, India, and the Philippines, where there's significant backlogs in some of these categories. Fortunately, the Philippines has not been as backlogged as China and India. A couple of years ago, the waiting times were enormous. They were 7 or 8 years. Now it's down to about 1.5 years. But still, if you manage to be an EB2 nurse because you're a nurse practitioner or a CRNA, we can put you in the EB2 category, and it should take no more than a year to immigrate to the US. And by the way, that 18-month backlog, I think it's, at least in my, I don't know what you think, Chris, I'll ask you, but I think it's probably reached its low now, and it's going to start going up right now. What do you think?
Yeah, no, unfortunately, I agree with Carl. I think that is going to go from its current 18 months, maybe to 20 months or 24 months over the course of 2019. I'm hoping it doesn't get much beyond about a 2 or 3 year backlog, but I see it the same way you do, Carl.
Okay.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Chris, what do you think is the main reason for that? Because people always ask that. They don't understand why it's going back and forth like that.
Right. Yeah. No. So the main reason for it is just demand. There is so much demand in the U.S. for Philippine nurses, and the Philippine nurses probably use over 90% of the Philippine EB3 quota. So the U.S. government says that not more than about 8,000 or so folks are allowed to apply under that EB3 quota before retrogression kicks in, and there is something like a 20,000 backlog in the EB3, which is why we have about an 18-month or so backlog. Now, the only one thing that we haven't really talked about here with respect to the EB2 and EB3 question, and it's really just tangential, but we do get this question, which is that physical therapists, and I realize this is a nurse form, but many of you may know physical therapists or have family members in physical therapy. Those are actually very easy to get EB2s for, because in recent years here in the US, we've moved to a DPT or a doctorate standard. So just a little aside there for any of you who are physical therapists or who know physical therapists.
And interesting that you bring up physical therapists, because one thing RNs and PTs have in common under the immigration law is under the Labor Department regulations, they're considered Schedule A shortage occupations. Those, for the last 20 years, those are the only 2 shortage occupations in the US. And if you're a nurse or a PT, definitely you want to use that to your advantage, because US employers, if they're bringing an engineer or an architect or a doctor or whoever, they have to go through a process where they advertise the job, and then they have to show the Labor Department that they can't find qualified Americans before they can immigrate somebody, get them a green card to the US. But the only 2 jobs where you never have to advertise are RNs and PTs, because they're already designated as shortage occupations. So you skip that step, and it makes it faster, at least if the Philippines didn't have that backlog. Go to step 2, where the employer files a petition for you. The immigration lawyers, we tend to use a lot of letters and numbers, but I'll just use a couple. So they file an I-140 with the Immigration Service. Once that I-140 gets approved, you end up getting an appointment, at the embassy on Rojas Boulevard in Manila or wherever you happen to be, and then you get a green card. That's the final step, and you come to the U.S. But that long step where employers have to advertise, they have to pay for the ads, they have to show the Labor Department they can't find Americans. That takes a long time, and some employers, not so much for nurses now because there's such a shortage, but some employers say, oh my God, I don't want to go through that process. So,
Sure.
In a way, if you're a registered nurse or a physical therapist, you're actually one of the lucky ones, because employers will be more ready to sponsor you than they might be to sponsor an OT or somebody or a lab tech.